All right. Well, it's the top of the hour, so I think we will go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Montana Institute on Ecosystems weekly seminar series, The Rough Cut. I'm Paige Tollison, and I'm pleased to welcome you today. This fall, we are highlighting the important topics of climate change and its impacts, so please be sure to check the calendar for upcoming talks in the series, which includes next week's talk by Dr. Julia Haggerty and the Montana Institute on Ecosystems interim director, Julia Haggerty, on Montana ranches as high net worth property, emerging land ownership trends, and their implications. We have room on the Rough Cut schedule on November 10th, December 1st, and December 8th for you, your colleagues, and your students to deliver seminars. Please contact me for more information if you're interested. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Jamie Peeler, who will speak on spatial resilience in forests recovering from fire. Dr. Peeler is a landscape ecologist dedicated to tackling forest conservation challenges in a more fire-prone world. Jamie recently completed her PhD in geography from Penn State University and is now a NatureNet Science Fellow with the Nature Conservancy and a postdoc at the University of Montana. As a reminder, this event is being recorded. We encourage you to keep your cameras and microphones off during the presentation. And please hold your questions till the end, and I'll keep track of your questions in the chat, and you can use the raise hand function or unmute yourself at the end of the presentation. All right, Jamie, I'll hand it off to you.
Yeah, thanks, Paige. So hi, everybody. I'm really excited to be speaking to you all today. As Paige mentioned, my name is Jamie Peeler, and I'm a NatureNet Science Fellow with the Nature Conservancy. And for the next 2 years, I'll be based at the University of Montana. I just wrapped up my PhD in geography at Penn State, where my research focused on post-fire tree recovery in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Today, I'll be sharing that research with you because, as highlighted through the Rough Cut series, the climate emergency is impacting our lives in very multifaceted ways, including how it's changing fire. Now, fire is a natural process that occurs worldwide, and in fact, many ecosystems need periodic fire to remain balanced and healthy. But due to climate change and built-up fuels and human ignitions, fires are increasing in size, frequency, and severity. In my own research, I engage fire through how it's impacting forest ecosystems. And my motivation for doing so is deeply ingrained in the work I did as a field technician before I returned to graduate school in 2015. At that time, I was living all over the US, working on different fire ecology research projects. And through that work, I really got to experience firsthand how fire is reshaping our forests across the US. But in terms of the day-to-day grind of my work, usually I was hiking with a small team to different sites that burned recently in these forests. And after arriving, we would pull out clipboards and data sheets and measuring tapes from our backpacks. And these were all tools that would help us really capture how different factors influenced a burn site's recovery. For example, we often want to capture the role of the surviving trees in the landscape, given that surviving trees are seed sources that jumpstart tree regeneration. And the tool that we would use to estimate that process is something called a rangefinder. It's a device that's about the size of your palm if you've never used one before. Typically, it's yellow and black. And with that rangefinder in hand, a team member would stand in the middle of a burn site, point the rangefinder towards the nearest surviving seed source, and press a button that prompted it to calculate the straight line distance between itself and that seed source. And we would write that number on the data sheet, which would later be used to estimate whether seeds would disperse into the burn site successfully. And in the last 5 years, that method of capturing straight line distance has been used frequently in scientific research on post-fire tree recovery. Here I'm highlighting a few field and modeling studies from the Western US that use straight line distance to test how different factors shape tree regeneration. And during the same time that this work was coming out in the scientific literature, I was working on my PhD in geography. And geography is a discipline that really required me to think more deeply about how patterns across space and time affect processes in ecosystems. And through getting exposed to that theme, I started to reflect more on how in reality, straight line distance doesn't actually account for all the seed sources in the surrounding landscape. It actually only accounts for that single nearest surviving seed source. At the same time, I was reading a lot about spatial resilience, which is a subset of resilience theory that captures how the spatial arrangement and spatial dynamics of a system's components support or reduce its capacity to reorganize after disturbance. And this idea of spatial resilience really emerged out of the coral reef literature. And in recent years, it's been really critical in leveraging the spatial arrangement of reefs and in a seascape to design successful marine protection areas. So ironically, I had become a fire ecologist, reading about coral reefs day after day. But for me, reading that literature really underscored the importance of accounting for all these seed sources in a landscape that are contributing to whether a burn site recovers naturally. Not just that single near surviving seed source that is being captured with that straight line distance. And that led me to ask in my recent research, what is the role of seed source area and arrangement in post-fire tree recovery? But fully accounting for seed source area and arrangement introduces multiple challenges. First, we need to determine the correct spatial scales to use. In other words, if we want to account for seed source area and arrangement, do we account for every seed source within 50 meters of a burn site, 100 meters? And secondly, these seed sources are not distributed across a flat landscape. Instead, they're distributed across landscapes with rugged terrain, as we're very familiar with here in Montana. And that rugged terrain can create physical obstacles that keep seeds from reaching a site successfully. Consequently, that terrain might influence the spatial scales we should be using to account for seed source area and arrangement. Additionally, rugged terrain causes some areas to receive more sun than others, which can make those areas warmer and drier, which can be really challenging conditions for tree seedlings to grow. And finally, forests are made up of more than one tree species, and each has its own strategy for recovering after fire. So you might have like a subalpine fir, which predominantly relies on wind dispersing seeds from surviving seed sources into the burn site. In contrast, other common tree species have much more localized strategies, like lodgepole pine that stores seeds in closed serotinous cones, or quaking aspen that can resprout from below ground roots. As a result, these divergent strategies might influence the role of seed source area and arrangement on post-fire tree recovery. And collectively, these challenges inspired me to design a research agenda that answered my overarching question through meeting two specific goals. So for goal one, I focused on unraveling how seed sources, scale, terrain, and recovery strategies interact to identify the spatial scales that we should be using to account for seed source area and arrangement. I then used those relevant spatial scales to inform goal two, where I tested the relative influence of seed source area and arrangement and local site conditions on the overall post-fire tree recovery. To dive deeper into those goals today, I'll begin with goal one. And here I was asking two research questions. The first one being, does seed source area and arrangement outperform straight line distance when anticipating post-fire tree recovery? And my hypothesis was yes. I expected to see that seed source area and arrangement would outperform that straight line distance metric. The second research question was, does seed source area and arrangement even have scale-dependent or terrain-dependent effects? And I expected to see that this would be the case, but only for subalpine fir. And this expectation was because subalpine fir is reliant on seeds being blown in from the surrounding landscape. I expected seed source area and arrangement to be relevant at spatial scales that would match the subalpine fir dispersal potential, which is typically less than 100 meters. And additionally, I did expect to see that terrain would reduce subalpine fir recovery by impeding seed delivery. And to answer these questions, I needed to find a study area that allowed me to test these hypotheses. So I spent 5 weeks driving all over Wyoming and Montana, looking for recent fires that would be just the right fit. And I eventually settled on two. which were the Bowl and Boulder fires that burned near Jackson, Wyoming. And in 2000, the Boulder fire established these large, high-severity patches, which essentially means that the fire killed trees in these large, contiguous areas and reduced the amount of seed sources in the landscape. In contrast, the Bowl fire burned in 2010 and left behind much smaller high-severity patches, keeping those nearby seed sources intact. And luckily for me, these fires occurred close to each other in areas with similar tree species and terrain, creating a natural experiment in which a gradient of seed sources occurred across a similar setting. After choosing that study area, I got to work downloading post-fire aerial imagery for both those fires. And these aerial images are at a high enough resolution that you can actually trace individual tree canopies in the imagery. So I did just that, and using remote sensing methods, I created these binary tree or no tree maps that would be my proxy for seed sources across these fires. On these maps, I identified potential burn sites to visit in the field, but before doing that, I needed to measure how their surrounding seed sources and terrain varied at different spatial scales. So therefore, at 6 nested spatial scales, I calculated 3 metrics that captured whether seed source area covered less or more of the landscape at a given spatial scale, whether seed source arrangement was less or more complex at that given spatial scale, and whether a burn site was positioned below or above the surrounding terrain. And then I was off to collect data on tree regeneration at 71 burn sites across the Bowl and Boulder fires. And collecting that data was basically an 8-week game of hide and go seek with these itty-bitty tree seedlings, many of which are no bigger than your thumb. And every morning, 2 research assistants and we would hike out to multiple sites, set up transects, and count the number of tree seedlings we would find. And after finishing those seedling counts, we also pulled out that rangefinder to measure the straight line distance to near seed source. Eventually, all that information came back with me to Pennsylvania, where again, I was completing my PhD at the time. And over the next year, I built 2 sets of statistical models to answer my research questions for goal 1. In the first set, my response variable was tree species presence. So this is a binary variable. It simply asks whether a specific tree species was present or not present in the count. And specifically, I was focused on 3 different tree species, subalpine fir, lodgepole pine, and quaking aspen. And the selection of these 3 tree species was to make sure that I was recovering those 3 different recovery strategies that are present in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I then built what I was calling distance models that predicted tree species presence using straight line distance and fire ID only. Those distance models were later compared to what I called landscape models, which predicted tree species presence using seed source area, seed source arrangement, and terrain at 6 spatial scales. In the second set of statistical models, my response variable was regeneration density. So this it's a continuous variable, and it counts for how many seedlings per hectare were counted. And again, I was looking at those same 3 tree species. I then built distance models that predicted regeneration density, again, using straight line distance and fire ID only. And those distance models were later compared to the landscape models that use seed source area, seed source arrangement, and terrain at those 6 spatial scales. And for this analysis, the glue that really held those statistical relationships together were generalized linear models. So what did I find? Let's see if we can use my pointer. Maybe WebEx won't let me actually do it. All right, I'll do my best to walk you guys through all this without a pointer. So what you're looking at here is in the first set of GLMs that predicted tree species presence, which overlap or looked at this 3 different species level groups. A strength of GLMs is that you can calculate a metric called delta AIC that big picture wise allows me to determine which models are best at predicting tree species presence in a group. And the rule of thumb is that having a delta AIC less than 2 means you're the best model, which I've highlighted using the filled colored circles. And as a reminder, I expected seed source area and arrangement to outperform straight line distance when anticipating post-fire tree recovery. meaning that I expected my landscape models, which are along the x-axis labeled as 25 meters, 50, 100, 100, 200, 250, to have a delta AIC of less than 2. But instead, I found that at least for tree species presence, the distance models were the ones that actually had that delta AIC less than 2. But interestingly, that trend did not hold for the set of models predicting regeneration density. And here I observed that the landscape models were the ones that had the delta AIC less than 2, but they occurred at these species-dependent spatial scales. For example, the best landscape models for subalpine fir contain seed source area and arrangement at 50 meters and 100 meters, while at 25 meters was the most relevant spatial scale for lodgepole pine and quaking aspen. And most likely, these species-dependent spatial scales capture those divergent recovery strategies that occur in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Additionally, for subalpine fir, I found that terrain did interact with seed source arrangement at 100-meter spatial scales. Specifically, even when a burn site was surrounded with sufficiently complex arrangements, whether it was positioned above or below terrain affected the ultimate regeneration density. And in fact, burn sites positioned above terrain, and therefore the surrounding seed sources, were most at risk of not recovering naturally. And collectively, these results show that at least for regeneration density, seed source area and arrangement is relevant at these species-dependent spatial scales. But what happens once you throw in local site conditions, so things like post-fire drought and soil nutrients and ground cover into the mix? So for goal 2, I tested that question with 2 additional research questions. First, I was asking, what is the relative influence of seed source area, arrangement, and local site conditions on post-fire tree recovery? And my hypothesis was that seed source area and arrangement would be most influential when recovery strategies required seeds from the surrounding landscape. And secondly, I was asking, do thresholds occur when seed source area is influential? And my hypothesis was yes, that thresholds will occur because achieving tree species presence requires fewer seeds from the surrounding landscape than reaching a robust regeneration density. To answer these questions, I needed data on those local site conditions. So to complement information that I already collected at the landscape level from goal 1, my research assistants and I collected data on elevation, aspect, slope, and ground cover at those 71 burn sites. We also collected soil samples, which were later analyzed back at Penn State for total nitrogen and carbon to nitrogen ratios. And finally, I used geospatial data to extract information on local water availability using maps on actual evapotranspiration and climatic water deficit. Once again, all that information came back home with me, and over the next year, I built statistical models to answer those 2 research questions. And in the first set, my response variable was again tree species presence, and I was looking at those same 3 tree species to make sure I covered the gradient of recovery strategies in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And I then built models that included seed source area and arrangement at those species relevant scales that were identified in goal 1, meaning that subalpine fir, in that model, I included seed source area and arrangement at 100-meter spatial scales. In contrast, for the lodgepole pine and quaking aspen models, 25-meter spatial scales were used. And the remaining predictive variables included those local site conditions that captured local water availability and soil nutrients and ground cover. For the second set of models, my response variable was stocking density. For those of you unfamiliar with the term, stocking is a term that's that's frequently used by the U.S. Forest Service, and it captures whether a forest is essentially dense enough to achieve management goals. So those goals can be having a dense enough forest to provide the needed timber or support wildlife habitat. And at my study area, a forest is considered stocked if there are 400 trees per acre. So I used that threshold to create a binary variable that delineated whether a location was stocked or not stocked. And instead of looking at individual tree species for this model, I was considering the entire recovering site. I then built a model that included landscape or seed source area and arrangement at all of the relevant species relevant scales and those local site conditions. And for this analysis, the glue that was holding all these statistical relationships together was a machine learning algorithm called random forest. And so what did I find for these two research questions? What you're looking at here is the first set of random forest models that predicted tree species presence for subalpine fir and lodgepole pine. For quaking aspen, I was not able to achieve a robust enough model, and moving on with further data analysis, I only focused on subalpine fir and lodgepole pine. And a really great strength of using random forest in this analysis is that I can calculate a metric called mean decrease in accuracy, which essentially breaks the relationship between a predictor variable and the response variable to see how it impacts the model's overall accuracy. So predictor variables with a higher mean decrease in accuracy are more influential than a predictor variable with a low mean decrease in accuracy. And to emphasize the most influential variables for each of these models, I've used colored circles for variables with a mean decrease in accuracy greater than 15%. So those will be the most influential to the model. And for these variables, in order to visualize any thresholds that might occur across these relationships, I also calculated partial dependence plots, which are in the colored squares to the right side of the figure, that allowed me to visualize relationships between those most important variables and the probability of subalpine fir and lodgepole pine presence, respectively. And I expected, as a reminder, I expected that seed source area and arrangement would be colored circles for the subalpine fir, but not for lodgepole pine, due to those divergent recovery strategies. And I observed that exact trend, given that seed source area at 100 meters was influential for subalpine fir, with the probability of presence increasing until a threshold hit at 10% seed source area. In contrast, no landscape level factors were most influential for lodgepole pine. Instead, local site conditions, including the percent cover of soil at the burn site and the level of soil nutrients, were most important for lodgepole pine. And finally, here you're looking at the random forest model results predicting stocking density. And again, I was expecting to see those landscape level factors to be most influential for stocking density because they contain those recovering sites contain species like subalpine fir. And I saw just that with seed source area at 100 meters and seed source arrangement at 25 meters, having some of the largest mean decreases in accuracy. Most likely seeing both of those species-dependent spatial scales is capturing those different recovery strategies happening in these mixed forests. And I will point you towards an interesting result in terms of the partial dependence plot for seed source area, where you see here that seed source area, or the probability of reaching stocking density increased with seed source area to about 40%. Which supports my hypothesis in my second research question that I expect to see different thresholds depending on whether you were interested in whether or not a specific tree species was present or whether or not a site would reach the density to achieve stocking density. And collectively, these findings from Goal 1 and Goal 2 help us better account for the role of seed source area and arrangement in post-fire tree recovery. And just to summarize some of these key findings, they include distance to near seed source is sufficient for predicting tree species presence after fire, but seed source area and arrangement can better anticipate regeneration density. Additionally, seed source area and arrangement must be measured at species-specific spatial scales, and for wind dispersed species, burn sites positioned above seed sources may have a harder time restocking naturally. And for those serotinous and resprouting tree species, local site conditions are more important than seed source area and arrangement for recovery. But kind of zooming out to a bigger picture, like why is it even important to account for these roles in a landscape. Well, as we witnessed in recent years, the US has entered a new fire era, and as a result, Montana and the rest of the Western US continue to endure these record-breaking fire years. And in this new fire era, landscapes are at the forefront of decision making around how we as people and as societies can coexist with fire. So, for example, there's increasing interest in allowing Indigenous fire stewardship to lead the way. For Indigenous people, a deep understanding of the landscape and its features have existed for thousands of years. And rather than seeing themselves as separate from the landscape, they view those relationships as reciprocal and interconnected. And therefore, they use fire as medicine for both landscapes and people alike. And from a more Western perspective, restoring and maintaining fire-resilient landscapes is a fundamental goal of the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy. For forests, that includes using landscapes to promote regeneration after fire, which is going to require us to better account for the role of seed source area and arrangement in post-fire tree recovery. And more broadly, we're living in a time where people are just really grappling with how to maintain forest resilience during this time of change that's unfolding across really vast landscapes. And that's going to require us to understand these spatial interactions and complexity that are playing out across our forest. But forests aren't the only ecosystem facing these changes. And again, throughout my PhD, I was reflecting on the parallels with other iconic ecosystems, including coral reefs. And right now, coral reefs are also contending with a lot of change in the form of increasing cyclone activity and overfishing, ocean acidification, and warming ocean temperatures that are causing bleaching. And just like forests, people are really grappling with how to maintain coral reef resilience during this time of change. But because coral reefs exist in the marine realm and forests exist in the terrestrial realm, these people are rarely in the same room together, despite having a shared vision and common goals. And so ultimately, these kind of reflections and musings culminated in my research, also including a more conceptual goal, where I used lessons and key findings learned from Goal 1 and Goal 2 to inform a conceptual framework for Goal 3. And specifically, I had two objectives with this goal. First, I was aiming to identify a concept that would transcend terrestrial and marine realm boundaries and provide common ground for resilience work that historically has occurred separately in ecology. And second, I wanted to apply that transrealm concept to case studies that underscore how marine and terrestrial realms share common stories and common pathways to resiliency. And to achieve Objective 1, I put forth using ecological memory as a potential transrealm concept. I selected ecological memory because it's actually really tightly linked to spatial resilience and the scientific literature. And it's also been around for more than 20 years. Here I'm showcasing work that was published since 2000 and focused on ecosystems in both marine and terrestrial realms. And how people talk about ecological memory has really transformed over the years. The way that I at least like to think about the concept is defining it as the ability of legacies from the past to impact present or future trajectories. And specifically, I'm thinking at the spatial scale of ecological communities and at the time scale of successional cycles. And with my geography and landscape ecology training, I tend to think of ecological memory as two separate spatial components. So first, integral memory includes those surviving legacies at the recovery site, which can facilitate within site recovery. For example, lodgepole pine trees have those serotinous cones. And secondly, we have external memory. So that is the surviving legacies at neighboring sites that facilitate between site recovery processes. For example, corals at neighboring sites spawn reproductive materials that create larvae, which travel hundreds of kilometers via ocean currents to eventually settle and repopulate a recovering site. Or per the key findings I just discussed from my research agenda, external memory could be the seeds that are blown in from 100 meters away to allow subalpine fur to regenerate at a burn site. And we can conceptualize internal memory and external memory along two axes that make up this resilient state space. So different communities might depend more predominantly on internal or external memory for recovery. But broadly, having high amounts of internal memory or high amounts of external memory, or some mixture of both after a disturbance, will maintain that community's resiliency. In contrast, if the disturbance erodes that internal external memory, then the community might not recover to its original identity. So I wanted to apply that conceptual framework to two different case studies, one representing the terrestrial realm and one representing the marine realm. So the first case study focused on lodgepole pine forests in Greater Yellowstone. Here, more than 50 fires burned in 1988, but with those serotinous cones in these lodgepole pine forests, the level of internally was very high after the fires. And as a result, those forests recovered prolifically after 1988. But with climate change, these severe fires are happening more and more frequently. And when historically these lodgepole pine forests were adapted to fires returning every 150 to 200 years, now some of these severe fires were returning to the same location in less than 30 years. And 30 years is just not enough time for these recovering forests to grow a new supply of serotinous cones. So consequently, the amount of internal memory that's in that system after the preceding fire has eroded. And there's recent modeling studies that show that locations where this eroded internal memory is occurring, the recovery of those sites can be delayed by almost 150 years. The second case study I focused on was looking at coral reefs near Moorea, which is part of a really large coral reef network in French Polynesia. And in the early 2000s, Moorea endured a tropical cyclone and a 2-year outbreak of coral-eating crown-of-thorns sea stars, one of which is pictured here. And these multiple disturbances initially reduced coral cover by over 90%. But with external memory remaining intact in the broader reef network, Moorea was able to successfully recover its coral cover in less than 5 years. But in 2019, an extremely large bleaching event hit the area, which impacted over 50% of that larger reef network. So consequently, external memory has been eroded in the system, and time will tell if enough legacies are going to remain for Moorea to make a recovery again. Collectively, the Greater Yellowstone Moorea case studies underscore that marine and terrestrial realms share these common stories and common pathways to resiliency. And using transrealm concepts like ecological memory can really allow us to work more closely with people engaged in different realms and different ecosystems on Earth. And breaking out of those traditional silos in Western science could be especially important now, as I'm sure as everyone knows in this room. The most recent IPCC report underscored that hotter temperatures are certain for at least the next 30 years. And without drastic climate action, those hotter temperatures are going to continue to increase beyond that time span. And as we're grappling with these certain impacts, we'll need all hands on deck to address the issues that are going to arise. And in organizing ourselves around a shared sense of purpose instead of necessarily a shared ecosystem, we can really start thinking more outside of the box and in ways that can contribute to building more resilient futures for both people and ecosystems on Earth. And with that, I just want to spend a minute or two just thanking people who made this research possible before turning it over to Q&A. Specifically, I had a lot of help in terms of funding to make this research possible. So I'd like to thank the National Science Foundation, National Geographic, the Joint Fire Science Program, NASA, and the Penn State Center for Landscape Dynamics for supporting the study. Additionally, I had a ton of very hard-working undergraduate research assistants that made all the data collection and processing possible. So thank you to Hunter Mitchell, Shanna Walker, Melody Sipe, Shelby Duncan, and Caroline Cabeza. My advisor, Erica Smithwick, and dissertation committee provided irreplaceable intellectual support throughout this journey. And I also would like to thank the graduate students in my old lab back at Penn State for contributing to thinking more deeply about this research. And with that, I can take questions. I'm guessing, Paige, are you going to moderate it? Or should I take questions?
Yeah, I will moderate it.
Okay.
Thank you so much for such an interesting presentation. So to have questions, you can either unmute yourself, use the raise hand function, or put your question in the chat. You must have been really super clear, Jamie.
That's always the case.
This is Bruce Maxwell. I'll ask you a question.
Sounds good.
I'm amazed. Very nice presentation and super interesting. I've studied lodgepole pine invasions in the southern hemisphere, and I think there, we've wrestled with what is it that makes them so different in terms of their ability to invade and move into grasslands and habitats not previously uh, where they wouldn't previously occur. And certainly, one of the things that comes to the top of those models is reproduction potential, and it seems to be so high there relative to their native lands. Um, Certainly distance from parent trees as well, and we were actually looking at individuals and looking at individual recruitment around those, and it's real distinctive. But the other part was also seed predation and how important that was in the hemisphere or in areas. Any sense for those factors or how your results, had you studied used the same approach in the southern hemisphere, what the outcomes might be?
Yeah, I mean, so is it kind of in terms of counting for like squirrels, basically, in terms of seed predation? Is that essentially the question?
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
that's it. I mean,
yeah. I mean, I
it's not
think
just squirrels, but I mean there were other species. And the interesting part is in some of the invaded areas where there were introduced seed predators, they weren't introduced intentionally as seed predators, but there were hares and things like European hares and things like that that were doing a fair amount of seed predation as well. But anyway, you could just assume it's squirrels.
yeah, for sure. I would always joke with my like PhD advisor, being like, "But what about the squirrels?" Because I mean, it happens in the north too, right? Like there are like small animals and birds that shift around these seeds. It's not just wind. And in some ways, it's a little bit of simplification, right, of the dispersal processes that are happening. One time I was in the field and I looked up and I saw like a bird just like carrying like a Doug fir cone across the sky. And I was like, oh, I wish I had a picture of that. That'd be great for like dispersal other than wind. Um, yeah, so I think it's an interesting question because I think like that is a gap in the northern part. And if there, but I also kind of see that in kind of this like classic fire ecology literature, is that that part of the story is often kind of left out. And so I think it is really important that maybe as a community that we start really grappling with the whole system, right? And how do you account for the animals that are moving things around the system as well? In terms of how that would compare with the northern to the south, I think that if it was like well done in both spheres, I'm guessing that it would match up in terms of processes. Maybe in terms of scales, like if the animals that are moving things around, maybe they have like maybe in the north and the south, maybe their like range and territories are different scales. Maybe that would change how some of these scales are relevant, just because the seeds are being like moved around further potentially in certain areas. But those are my kind of thoughts on it. That like A, it's definitely a gap in my own study, and B, I could see how they would change the spatial scales if if the animals are moving them around at larger or shorter distances than what the wind would be doing.
Yeah. Have you interacted at all with Kim Davis?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I am
Okay.
in
So
Phil
she did all that
Hygera's.
work with me when she was a PhD student here. So,
Yeah, I love Kim. I was just hanging out with Kim last night. She's great.
right. So you probably had these discussions with her.
Yeah, she's great. It's great to have like another early career scientist here too. But I guess that's something I could have mentioned on the top. So in terms of how my fellowship is set up, I have TNC supervisors, but I also have an
Mhm.
academic advisor, and that's Phil Hygera here at
Oh, good.
UM.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. All right. Bill worked with us as well. So
Awesome.
good.
Yeah. I'll tell
Well,
Kim to
thank
say
you
hi.
very much. That was great. Great presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce.